The crash of a metal tray echoing down the sterile corridor wasn't what made the ward freeze. It was the low, ragged roar that followed. In room 412 lay a man broken by a roadside bomb, and he was currently tearing his third four out with his teeth. The break room of the trauma wing smelled like burnt Folgers and despair. Nora sat at the chipped laminate table, pressing the heel of her hand against her right eye. The fluorescent light overhead flickered with a persistent, low-frequency hum that vibrated right into the roots of her teeth. She hadn't slept for more than 4 hours at a stretch in 3 days, and her scrubs felt stiff with dried sweat and the ghostly residue of hospital-grade sanitizers. The heavy wooden door swung open, hitting the rubber wall stopper with a dull thud. Sarah, a nurse with 5 years on the floor and a usually unflappable demeanor, marched in. Her face was flushed, mottled red, down to her collarbone. She threw a plastic clipboard onto the counter. It clattered loudly, the metal clip snapping against the formica. "I'm done," Sarah said, her voice shaking. She pressed her fingertips hard against her eyelids, trying to stem tears that were already spilling. "I am absolutely done." He just threw a full pitcher of ice water at my head. Nora didn't move immediately. She let the silence stretch, listening to the wet sniffles coming from her coworker. Slowly, Nora dropped her hand from her face and looked at the clipboard. "Room 412? Nora asked, her voice flat, gravelly from underuse. "Commander Callahan," Sarah choked out, grabbing a rough brown paper towel from the dispenser and scrubbing at her cheeks. "The SEAL, the one who came in last week from Ramstein. He's a psycho, Nora. An absolute animal. He won't let anyone change the dressings on his thigh. He's refusing the Dilaudid, and he's biting at anyone who gets near his central line. The doctor is talking about sedating him just to get his vitals." Nora stared at the clipboard. She knew the rumors. The whole floor knew them. Commander Jack Callahan, IED blast outside some unnamed village that didn't exist on public maps. Shrapnel had shredded his left femur, and the resulting fire had taken a layer of skin off his left torso and arm. He had arrived swathed in bandages, a high-value asset wrapped in the silence of classified operations. The hospital staff had whispered about him like he was a dark deity, a decorated war hero, a lethal operator, a man to be revered and feared. Nora found the hero worship exhausting. In her experience, trauma stripped everyone down to the exact same raw, uncooperative meat. She stood up, her knees popped. The cheap foam soles of her white clogs squeaked against the linoleum as she walked over to the counter and picked up the chart. "Is the IV still in?" Nora asked, flipping past the face sheet to the medication schedule. "Barely," Sarah said, leaning against the sink. "It's taped to his right hand, but he's picking at it. He said if I came back in, he'd break my fingers. He wasn't joking." "Nora, look at his eyes. The guy is still in the sandbox. He's not here. His cefepime is an hour late," Nora noted, tapping a short, unvarnished fingernail against the paper. The clinical detachment in her own voice was a defense mechanism she had honed over a decade of wiping up blood, vomit, and the shattered pieces of human dignity. She didn't have the energy to be afraid of a wounded man. She had a mountain of student debt, a car that stalled at every red light, and a lower back that screamed every time she bent over. Her capacity for fear was tapped out. "Let the charge nurse deal with it," Sarah pleaded. "They need to bring in security. Security will just escalate it. And the charge nurse is currently dealing with a code on the surgical floor," Nora said. She closed the metal cover of the chart. "I'll go." "Nora, don't. He's out of his mind. I need the overtime, Sarah. If I don't get these meds in him, the paperwork alone will keep me here past shift change." Nora walked out of the break room. The hallway of the trauma wing was a sensory assault, even on a quiet day. The air was unnaturally cold, pushed through heavy vents to keep infection rates down, yet it always smelled underneath of something metallic and faintly sweet, the undeniable scent of necrotic tissue and iodine. Monitors beeped in a discordant symphony from the open doors. A resident hurried past, his stethoscope swinging wildly, avoiding her gaze. As she approached the end of the hall, The silence began to pool. Room 412 was isolated, flanked by two empty rooms. It was a VIP suite, technically, but right now, it felt like a cage. Outside the heavy oak door, an orderly was standing with his back pressed against the wall, holding a mop bucket. He looked at Nora, his eyes wide, and shook his head silently. Nora stopped at the sanitizer dispenser outside the door. She pressed the lever with her elbow, catching the cold, alcoholic foam in her palm. She rubbed her hands together, the sharp chemical smell stinging her nostrils. She took a breath. It wasn't a deep, centering breath of a hero preparing for battle. It was the shallow, weary sigh of a woman who just wanted to get her job done and go home to feed her cat. She reached out, wrapped her hand around the cold metal lever of the door handle, and pushed it open. The first thing that hit her was the dark. The heavy blackout blinds were drawn tight against the mid-morning sun. The only light in room 412 came from the digital displays of the monitors, sickly greens and harsh blues that cast jagged shadows across the walls. The second thing was the smell. It was thick, almost suffocating. The distinct, coppery tang of old blood weeping through bandages, mixed with the acrid stench of stress sweat, unwashed hair, and the sharp bite of chlorhexidine. It smelled like a locker room inside a slaughterhouse. Nora stepped inside and let the door click shut behind her. The sound was deafening in the quiet. She didn't look at the bed immediately. She looked at the floor. A plastic water pitcher lay shattered near the footboard, ice cubes melting into a dark puddle on the gray linoleum. A soggy paper cup was flattened nearby. "Get out." The voice came from the shadows. It wasn't a shout. It was a gravelly, dehydrated rasp, entirely devoid of human warmth. It was the sound of a stone dragging across concrete. Nora kept her eyes on the floor, carefully stepping over the puddle so her clogs wouldn't squeak. She moved toward the small sink in the corner of the room, pulled on a pair of purple nitrile gloves, and snapped them over her wrists. The latex-free material snapped loudly in the quiet room. She finally turned to look at the bed. Commander Jack Callahan was pressed as far back into the mattress as the raised headboard would allow. He was a large man, but trauma had hollowed him out. His collarbones looked like knives under his pale skin. The left side of his body, from the shoulder down to the thigh, was wrapped in thick, white gauze, some of it stained with fresh, yellow-pink serous fluid. An external fixator, a brutal-looking contraption of metal rods and pins, protruded from his left leg, holding his shattered femur in place. But it was his face that made the other nurses run. His hair was dark and greasy, plastered to his forehead with fever sweat. A jagged laceration crawled up his jawline, closed with angry black sutures. His eyes, sunken deep into dark, bruised sockets, were bloodshot. The whites were a sickly, yellowish hue from the heavy narcotics his liver was struggling to process. He was staring at her with a terrifying, unblinking intensity. It wasn't the look of a man in pain. It was the look of a predator assessing a threat. He had his right hand clamped over his left forearm, his fingers curled into claws, hovering right over the transparent dressing that held his IV line in place. "I told you," Callahan growled, his chest heaving with shallow, painful breaths. "To get the fuck out." Nora stood at the foot of the bed. She didn't cross her arms. She didn't puff out her chest. She just let her shoulders slump a fraction of an inch. "I heard you," Nora said. Her voice was quiet, lacking any inflection of authority or fear. "But your cefepime is an hour late. If you don't get it, that leg is going to go septic. If you go septic, they're going to chop it off. And I am not doing the paperwork for a transfer to the amputee ward today." Callahan blinked. The pure banality of her response seemed to disrupt his rhythm for a microsecond, but the rage quickly flooded back. "I don't need your goddamn antibiotics. I don't need anyone in here. You take one more step, and I'm ripping this line out." His fingers tightened around the plastic tubing. A tiny bead of dark blood swelled under the clear tape on his hand. Nora looked at his hand, then up at his face. Her heart was beating a little faster now, a dull, rhythmic thud in her throat. She wasn't entirely immune to fear. He was dangerous. He was a trained killer, experiencing a psychotic break from pain and PTSD. If he decided to lunge, broken leg or not, he could snap her neck before security even badged into the hallway. She felt a bead of sweat trickle down her ribs, cold against her skin. "Okay," Nora said. She turned away from him. Callahan froze, visibly confused by the retreat. Nora didn't go to the door. She went to the window. She reached out and grabbed the plastic wand of the blinds. With a sharp twist, she opened them exactly 2 inches. A harsh, narrow blade of natural sunlight sliced into the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. Callahan flinched, turning his face away from the light with a sharp hiss of pain. "What are you doing?" he snapped. "I can't see the port in the dark," Nora said, walking over to the IV pole. She grabbed a fresh bag of antibiotics and hung it on the metal hook. The plastic crinkled loudly. She primed the tubing, her fingers moving with the muscle memory of 10,000 identical motions. The clear liquid dripped steadily into the chamber. She walked to the right side of the bed. She was now well within his striking distance. She could feel the heat radiating off him. He was running a fever, high enough to bake the moisture out of his breath. He tensed, his muscles coiling under the thin hospital gown. "I said, I'll rip it out." Nora stopped. She looked down at him, her eyes tracing the tight, white-knuckled grip he had on his own arm. "If you rip that out," Nora said, her voice dropping into a tired, conversational register, "blood is going to get on the sheets. Then I have to strip the bed, which means rolling you onto your left side. Your left side is currently a 3rd-degree burn. It will hurt so badly you will likely vomit. Then I have to clean the vomit." She paused, swallowing the dry lump in her throat. Her hands were shaking slightly. She hated that they were shaking, but she couldn't stop it. She forced herself to look directly into his bloodshot, chaotic eyes. "And then," she continued, "I have to find a new vein. And looking at your severe dehydration and the trauma to your circulatory system, your veins are completely shot. I will have to dig for one, with a very thick needle. So, please, don't make me dig." Callahan stared at her. The silence in the room stretched until it felt fragile, ready to snap. He was searching her face for something: pity, terror, maternal coddling. He found a 3-4-year-old woman with dark circles under her eyes, a messy bun held together by a cheap plastic clip, and a slight tremor in her gloved fingers. She wasn't trying to save his soul. She was just trying to do her job. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the wet rasp of his breathing and the rhythmic shh click of the blood pressure cuff inflating on a neighboring room's monitor through the wall. Slowly, agonizingly, Callahan's fingers uncurled. He didn't lower his hand, but he released his grip on the tubing. He let his head fall back against the pillow, his jaw clenching so hard Nora could hear the teeth grinding. He turned his face toward the wall, presenting his right arm to her in a rigid, resentful surrender. Nora exhaled, a tiny, stuttering breath out of her nose. She stepped closer. She wiped the port with a pungent alcohol swab, the sharp smell cutting through the heavy air. She attached the syringe of saline to flush the line. "This is going to taste like metal in the back of your throat," she muttered mechanically, pushing the plunger. Callahan grimaced, swallowing hard, but he didn't speak. She hooked up the antibiotic line, adjusting the drip rate on the pump. The machine let out a cheerful, automated chirp that felt entirely out of place in the dark, hostile room. Nora didn't linger. She didn't offer a soothing word or a gentle pat on the shoulder. She knew that any attempt at comfort right now would be treated as an act of aggression. She gathered her trash, crushing the plastic wrappers into a tight ball in her fist. She walked toward the door, peeling off her gloves. She tossed them into the red biohazard bin by the sink with a soft thud. Just as her hand touched the door handle, Callahan's voice scraped through the dark again. "What's your name?" It wasn't a question, it was a demand. Nora paused, looking over her shoulder. The narrow beam of sunlight was cutting across the bed, missing his face but illuminating the scarred, ruined landscape of his leg. "Nora," she said. She pushed the door open and stepped out into the chaotic noise of the hallway, letting the heavy door click firmly shut behind her. By Tuesday, Nora had become the unofficial, unpaid handler of room 412. The hospital bureaucracy worked in predictable ways. Find the path of least resistance and exploit it until it breaks. Because Nora was the only nurse who could enter Callahan's room without triggering a code gray, she was assigned his dressing changes, his vitals, and his medication schedule. She didn't complain to management. She just aggressively logged every minute of penalty overtime on her timesheet. The morning routine was brutal. Debriding the burns on Callahan's left torso required scrubbing dead tissue away to prevent infection. It was a medieval process wrapped in modern, sterile packaging. Nora pushed her supply cart into his room at 0900. The heavy blackout blinds were still drawn, but Callahan had demanded a small, harsh reading light be clamped to his bed rail. It cast long, grotesque shadows against the acoustic ceiling tiles. He was awake. He was always awake. His eyes tracked her the moment the door unlatched. "Dressing change," Nora said, parking the cart. She didn't wait for permission. She snapped on a pair of blue nitrile gloves. Callahan didn't speak. He just turned his head away, staring at the blank beige wall, his jaw muscles feathering under his skin. Nora lowered the bed rail. The smell hit her first, the sharp, bleach-like sting of Dakin's solution mixing with the heavy, organic scent of healing flesh. She peeled back the tape on his flank. It made a loud, tearing sound. Callahan sucked in a sharp breath through his teeth. His right hand gripped the aluminum safety rail so hard the metal creaked. "I know," Nora muttered. She discarded the soiled gauze into a red biohazard bag. It landed with a wet, heavy thud. She picked up the saline irrigation syringe. The water was room temperature, but against raw nerve endings, she knew it felt like liquid fire. Flushing it now, she squeezed the plunger. Callahan let out a low, guttural groan, his chest arching off the mattress. His knuckles turned bone white, the muscles in his neck strained, thick cords standing out against his pale throat. He didn't scream. The silence of his agony was somehow worse than if he had just yelled. Nora didn't stop. Hesitation only prolonged the torture. She worked quickly, her hands moving with mechanical precision. She wiped away the slough, applied the thick, chalky layer of silver sulfadiazine cream, and layered fresh, dry gauze over the wound. "You're rough," Callahan ground out. Sweat was pooling in the hollow of his throat. His chest heaved. "I'm efficient," Nora corrected, taping down the edges of the dressing. The adhesive stuck to her gloves, annoying her. "Gentle takes 20 minutes. Efficient takes 8. You pick." Callahan turned his head slowly to look at her. The fever had broken 2 days ago, and without the yellow haze of delirium, his eyes were a startling, piercing gray. They were calculating eyes. The eyes of a man who stripped down every room he entered to assess the exits and the threats. "You don't talk to me like I'm dying," he observed. His voice was still a ruined rasp, but the venom was gone. It was replaced by a cold, clinical curiosity. "You're not dying," Nora said. She stripped her gloves off and shoved them into her pocket, not wanting to cross the room to the trash can just yet. She leaned against the rolling cart, pressing a hand into the aching small of her back. "Your labs are stable. Your white count is down. You're just miserable." Miserable. A dry, humorless sound rattled in his chest. A laugh, maybe, or a cough. "My career is over. My leg is held together by hardware store screws. Half my team is in flag-draped boxes at Dover." The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. The monitors beeped their steady, indifferent rhythm. Nora looked at the floor. The linoleum was speckled gray. She felt the familiar, heavy urge to offer a platitude. They died heroes. You survived for a reason. Time heals all wounds. The hospital-mandated grief counseling scripts filed away in her brain felt cheap. They tasted like ash. She looked back up at him. That sucks. Callahan blinked. It sucks, Nora repeated, her voice deadpan. It is completely, irreparably awful, and there is absolutely nothing I can say to make it better, so I'm not going to try. She grabbed the metal handle of the cart and pulled it away from the bed. Callahan watched her. For the first time since he had been wheeled into the trauma wing, the rigid, hostile set of his shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. He let his head sink back into the thin hospital pillow. "Can you get me a different pillow?" he asked. "This one feels like it's stuffed with gravel." "No," Nora said, pushing the cart toward the door. "They all feel like gravel. It's a hospital, not the Ritz." She walked out. She didn't look back, but as the heavy door clicked shut, she thought she heard the faintest, dry exhale of amusement from the dark room. The shift on Thursday night was a nightmare. A multi-car pileup on the interstate had flooded the ER, and the overflow bled into the trauma wing. Nora had been running for 9 straight hours. Her scrubs were stained with someone else's coffee. Her feet throbbed in rhythm with her heartbeat, and she had a tension headache that felt like a tight steel band across her forehead. At 0315, the ward finally quieted into the graveyard lull. The lights in the corridor were dimmed to a dusky half-glow. The only sounds were the hum of the HVAC system and the squeak of rubber soles on tile. Nora was sitting at the nurse's station, mindlessly clicking through a charting module on a sticky keyboard when the shouting started. It wasn't a yell of pain. It was a battle cry, guttural, panicked, and raw. It came from room 412. Nora shoved her chair back. It rolled and slammed into the counter. She sprinted down the hall, her clogs sliding on the freshly waxed floor. She hit the heavy oak door with her shoulder and shoved it open. The room was pitch black. The sound of metal clashing against metal filled the space. Callahan was thrashing violently in the bed. The heavy steel rods of his external fixator were smashing against the raised side rails with sickening force. If he kept it up, he was going to rip the pins straight out of his fractured bone. "Callahan," Nora shouted over the noise. He didn't hear her. He was trapped somewhere else. In the dirt, in the dark, in the fire. He swung his good arm wildly, ripping his oxygen cannula from his nose. The plastic tubing whipped through the air. Nora didn't hit the call button. Security would tackle him. They would hold him down, and he would fight until his heart gave out. She lunged toward the bed. "Get down," Callahan roared, a terrifying, commanding bark that belonged on a battlefield. He was trying to roll over, trying to cover an invisible body with his own. Nora grabbed a plastic cup of ice water from the bedside table. She ripped the lid off and threw the contents directly into his face. The freezing water hit him with a loud splash. Callahan gasped, a massive, shuddering intake of air. His eyes snapped open. They were wild, dilated, searching the darkness frantically. "Look at me," Nora commanded. She didn't touch him. She knew better than to touch a man waking up from a war. She slammed her hand flat against the hard plastic of the tray table. Smack. "Jack, look at me. Right here." His chest was heaving. He turned his head toward the sharp sound. Water dripped from his chin, soaking into the collar of his gown. "Name 5 things in this room," Nora demanded, her voice sharp, cutting through the panic with the precision of a scalpel. "Now, do it." Callahan stared at her, his breathing ragged. He was trembling, a massive, violent shiver that rattled the bed frame. "Name them," she snapped. The monitor," he choked out. His voice cracked. "That's 1. Keep going. The door. 2. Give me 3 more. Look around. Look at the room." Callahan swallowed hard. His eyes darted around the dim shadows, slowly tethering to the mundane reality of the hospital room. The table, the IV pole. "You, me," Nora confirmed. She let her shoulders drop. She leaned heavily against the edge of the tray table, suddenly aware of how badly her own hands were shaking. You're in a hospital in Virginia. It's Tuesday. Or maybe Wednesday. Honestly, I'm too tired to know. But you are here, not there. The fight drained out of him all at once. It was awful to watch. The terrifying, lethal operator vanished, leaving behind a broken, exhausted man shivering in a wet gown. He slumped back against the mattress. He raised his right hand and covered his face. The silence stretched. It wasn't the hostile, predatory silence of their first meeting. It was heavy, weighted with shame, and the raw, humiliating exposure of a broken mind. Nora didn't offer a tissue. She didn't tell him it was okay. She turned her back to him, giving him the one thing he desperately needed: privacy. She walked over to the linen cart in the corner. She moved slowly, deliberately making noise. The plastic wrapping crinkled loudly as she pulled out a fresh, dry hospital gown and a warm blanket from the heating cabinet. The blanket smelled like warm cotton and industrial laundry detergent. She walked back to the bed and tossed the dry clothes onto the foot of the mattress. "Change the gown," Nora said, looking firmly at the wall above his head. "I'll pretend I didn't see you rip your oxygen off, and you pretend I didn't just throw water in the face of a Navy commander." Callahan slowly lowered his hand. He looked at the dry gown, then up at her. The harsh lines of his face were softened by exhaustion. "You didn't call security," he rasped. "Paperwork." Nora lied smoothly. "Too much paperwork." She turned and walked toward the door. "Nora." She stopped, her hand hovering over the metal lever. "Thank you." The words were quiet, stripped of all ego. They were just true. Nora looked over her shoulder. The room was still dark, but the jagged edges didn't seem so sharp anymore. He wasn't a monster, and she wasn't a savior. They were just two tired people, surviving the night in a room that smelled like iodine and old ice. "Don't make it a habit, Callahan," she said, her voice dry. "I don't get paid enough to be your alarm clock." She pushed the door open and stepped out into the bright, fluorescent hallway. The cool air hit her face. She closed the door firmly behind her, checked her watch, and started walking back toward the nurse's station to finish her charting. She had 3 hours left, a car that probably wouldn't start, and a cat waiting for breakfast. It was just another shift. But as she sat down and pulled the keyboard toward her, the tension headache wasn't quite as heavy. Did this raw, unflinching look into the realities of trauma and human connection keep you listening? If Nora and Jack's story resonated with you, hit that like button to let us know. Don't forget to share this video with someone who appreciates grounded, gritty storytelling without the cliches. Subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss our upcoming medical dramas and psychological deep dives. Drop a comment below. What would you do in Nora's shoes?
Hi, my name is Jeffrey Williams, the owner and manager of Second Ember Reborn. After watching the video, everyone feared the wounded SEAL commander. Until the quiet new nurse walked in and silenced the room, I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me was the quiet compassion in the middle of so much pain and frustration. Nora never tried to be a hero. She simply showed up, stayed calm, and treated someone as a person when everyone else only saw a problem. That small act of understanding seemed to make all the difference. Do you think Nora's honesty was what finally reached Callahan? And was there a moment in the story that stood out to you the most? If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, feel free to like the video or subscribe for more. Thanks for watching and being part of the conversation.